Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Waldman. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Tuesday, December 27th, 2016, coming to the end of the terrible stretch known as 2016. No reason to believe 2017 will be any better, but hey, don't lose heart. Well, that's it. Ruin the show. Okay, not much, nowhere to go but up, I guess we could say. How about that? That's pretty optimistic. Nowhere to go but up from here, and no one to help bring us up but Greg Dworkin. So Greg Dworkin will be with us. I see already a raft of stories appearing in my Skype feed. So fantastic. He'll give us some direction and help us find our footing after the long holiday weekend. How did it go for you? How was your Boxing Day? I was asking you this morning, did anybody do any boxing? I don't really know what that is. I've looked it up a couple of times. It has to do with mailboxes. Not really sure why it isn't Mailbox Day, but okay. I blame the British for that, and that's easy enough to do. Let's see. Any fun things going on today? Not that I can tell so far. Just trying to sort of catch up with the weekend's happenings. Of course, it was an extra long weekend, so it's difficult to wrap my head around it. And the news cycle being what it is, well, gee whiz. It's just hard to stay on top of things. Anyway, Bill in Portland, Maine is on top of things, and he has his morning tweet ready for us. Kagro X, that's me, David Waldman, now that Daily Coast Radio is live, shows off his Hanukkah-related injuries, dreidel splinters, youch. Yes, that's right, wooden dreidel. This time, of course, the kid from the song was smart. He made it out of clay, although that can, create its own issues, shrapnel from shattering clay, etc. My younger son set I believe is a world record of 23 shin spins in a row during a game last week. I don't know if they all came in a row, but he sat down for a game with other kids just to show them how it was done, and, well, he showed them how to lose anyway. So we're out of chocolate coins in this house. Anyway, Greg Dworkin joins us from Connecticut. Good morning, Greg.
Hey, good morning. Sorry to join you early,
but okay.
I got to scoot off a little early, and I keep noticing that life interferes a bit with the show lately. So I feel like I should send Life a sternly worded letter because that's the right thing to do in Washington.
That's what Life likes.
But, it has to be capitalized, sternly worded letter. Otherwise, they don't pay attention.
Okay.
And do not use Comic Sans font. They won't pay attention to that either.
That's not stern.
No. It's comic.
It says it right in the name.
It says it right there in the name. It's just like Star Wars. This movie was about war. Well, it says Star Wars right in the name. What is your problem with it? That was our Jewish Christmas movie.
Oh, yeah? Okay.
For Jewish Christmas, what you're supposed to do is go to a movie and then have Chinese food.
Right.
Because why? Because Chinese restaurants are open. That's why.
That's right.
Italian restaurants are not. They're celebrating Christmas, but Chinese restaurants are generally open, and you can usually find one even when everything else is closed. So that's why it's traditional. And this year was Rogue One because my kids get to pick. Even though they're in their 30s, they still get to pick.
Well, I think that's probably about right for the people in the 30s.
And so they wanted to see that one. And when you go on Christmas at around 3 p.m., you not only get to see everybody who's Jewish in your town because they're all at the movies, but it's not crowded, and you can sit wherever you want.
Yeah.
You don't have to sit in the front row with this giant screen with, huge, loud noises bursting in your ears.
No, but that's exciting.
Yeah, so it is fun when that happens.
All right. Well,
anyway, Boxing Day, as we learned from Wikipedia, is a holiday celebrated the day after Christmas, and traditionally it's when the tradesmen get their Christmas boxes. A present or gratuity. You know how your newspaper deliverer may be the person who picks up the garbage. Occasionally, the post person threaten you around Christmas.
Do they?
Yeah, nice delivery system you have here. Be ashamed if nothing happened to it. Here's my name, and why don't you leave me a present? That kind of thing.
Okay. Well, I'm a little bit further removed from that. They've done a good job building barriers between us and the people.
And we know everybody by name. We know their stories. They send you letters in small towns.
I guess so. Yes, and
before Christmas. Hi, this is who I am. I know I only talk to you once a year, but here it is. I needed a new car, so sorry about missing some of those deliveries. And just want you to know that we care about you the entire year, but it's Christmas, so I'm just letting you know what my name is.
Right.
In case you want to leave me a tip or anything like that.
Yes. Well, it has to do with giving out gifts and money and putting them in mailboxes for the mailbox guys. And what do you?
Well deserved.
Yeah.
It's just that in America you do it when you get to it, and in England you do it on Boxing Day.
All right. It's interesting though, Boxing Day. Like, okay, I understand you get your Christmas boxes, but it's a gift. Gifting day, giving out money day. Boxing.
Yeah, extortion day. I mean, you can call it whatever you want to.
Yeah, the British feel uncomfortable talking about money, so boxing, fine.
Yeah, so boxing, fine. In Britain, it was a custom for tradespeople to collect Christmas boxes of money or presents on the first weekday after Christmas as thanks for good service throughout the year. This is mentioned in Samuel Pepys' diary entry for 19 December 1663. This custom is linked to an older British tradition, older than 1663. That's what I like about Britain.
Yes.
Since they would have to wait on their masters on Christmas Day, the servants of the wealthy were allowed the next day to visit their families. Isn't that sweet? The employers would give each servant a box to take home containing bonuses and gifts and sometimes leftover food.
Yeah. KFC.
So that's mighty giving of them.
Yes, well, back in the days of the master-servant relationship.
Yeah, humbug. Mm-hmm. So, our folks work hard. They're up at like 4:30 in the morning delivering stuff some days. And, we do know them by name. So we miss them when they're not here, and we give gladly. It's just always funny because, like, we're ready to give anyway, but they still give us these notes saying, don't forget about us.
Well, pays to remind. We don't get those sorts of things around here. Like I said, we've been removed from there's this distance between us and all the people providing our services, partly because we don't have individual mailboxes here anymore. We got just giant ones parked out by the common area parking lot with little numbers for each of us.
Right.
And we have to, we walk out there and unlock it. So the mail delivery is a matter of the truck driving up, opening the back of the grid there and stuffing letters in there, sometimes in the wrong box, and then taking off. And we never see our mail delivery person unless they ring your bell because they've got a parcel for you. And that's usually our guy throws it in the driveway and then tries to hit your doorbell with a rock from the car.
Right.
and then he's gone.
Yeah.
So we run
because you
over
never
the
know.
deal
There
with
might be dogs.
Yeah. Right. Well, and of course milk delivery that went out the window in 18.
Yeah, but when we get UPS and when we get FedEx and
our guys
even
run
out
away.
here in small towns we get that stuff. It's always the same driver.
Yeah. That would make
and
it.
they know the neighborhood. They know which houses have the dogs you have to be careful of and which houses have the dogs where, yeah, right.
Huh.
You are not threatening. Just go sit.
Right. I don't know. Our guys tend to run away. If they have to ring the doorbell, they ring it and they're gone. And by the time you get to the door, they're gone and the package is halfway down the stairs.
Yeah, exactly.
All right.
So, and it's important to talk about this. I'll tell you why in a minute. And then I just want to give you a weather report too, and it's important to talk about that too. Today in Newtown, it is 51 degrees. Little global warming here. But the funny thing is that by 7 o'clock tomorrow, it's going to be 20.
Tomorrow?
Yeah.
Wow.
Tomorrow it's going to be 26 degrees. So we're going to go from 53 to 26 in about 12 hours.
That's not a lot of degrees.
No, but it's going to be a little chilly tomorrow. Now, when you were away for Christmas, that is to say, when you were away from the radio show,
right?
You left listen to an old show.
Yeah, I did.
And it was from 2 years ago?
Yes.
And one of our listeners contacted me, one of our loyal listeners contacted me and said, the funny thing is, listening to your show from 2 years ago, here you guys were just talking about stuff with not a care in the world that the world was going to end and everything was going to, go south. And it was fun. Yeah. It was like you talked about normal stuff and nobody had to worry about whether or not you had a a unqualified oaf whose finger was close to the button to launch nuclear weapons. You didn't have to worry about the fact that the cabinet was going to be consisting of, to a person, either an unqualified a-hole or a qualified a-hole with an agenda that makes them an a-hole, like Jeff Sessions, for example.
Right.
You didn't have to worry about those things 2 years ago when you listened to the show. And it was it's a bit nostalgic, you know?
Yes, well,
the time and day where you didn't have to, stick your head out of the covers and say, are we still here?
Yeah. Well, I like, I'm always telling my kids about what it was like in the old days when we were growing up, and so I'm able to...
You had to go up both hills, both ways, and everything was always uphill and always snowed, and you had to shovel your way to school before you got there.
It's important that kids know about living under the threat of nuclear annihilation.
Yeah, that too, because I'm even older than you, and I remember being trained to get under your desk, and, we had drills.
Yeah.
If you hear the siren, get under the desk, bend over, and, kiss your butt goodbye. And they were real drills. They actually had people do that.
Yes. Donald Trump still has people bend over and get under his desk.
Yeah, well, that's a different story. You have all of that. And at the same time, you do have these new cabinet members, and they don't look great. But I just want to have one other story here. It's actually at the end of the stuff that I sent you. It's from a local CBS Detroit outlet, and reminds people you still have time to give one last gift this holiday season with a blood donation.
Oh, yes. Look at that. Everyone loves getting blood. So put it in the mailbox.
The point of that?
Oh, yes.
We are still good people, even if Donald Trump and his cronies are not.
Right.
And there's still stuff you can do, and there's still stuff you can do for everybody else. And that they can't take that away from us.
That is true. Donald Trump goes to blood donation centers with a straw.
He sells swamp water.
He might. He just put a little red food coloring in it and goes to the places where you can sell your plasma.
You fell for it. Oh, these rubes.
He might. All right. Well, blood donation, always a good way to wrap things up. Do take care of that before New Year's Eve. I guess. I mean,
otherwise it'll be for next year.
Yeah, if your blood alcohol content is very high, can they take your blood?
I think there's a lot of people who would want it.
Yeah, that might be.
I can't drink, but you can drink for me.
Right. Oh, yeah, that's right. It's not a violation of the court order if I just pipe this stuff into my veins.
Yeah.
Although the courts are concerned about what you pipe into your veins.
That with coffee. Why not?
Yeah.
So, I have this story here from the New York Times, and remember, this is the last week that I have to do this, because next week you're getting a subscription and you can look it up. Besides the fact that the clock starts right away, you get your 10 or 5 or whatever, 3. Or
right. Yeah, I gotta be thrifty in the new year too.
Yeah.
But they'll get their money. Yep. And I think they have a year-long thing on.
You can do it when you have a chance. Oh, look at that. I'm getting a call on my iPhone from Chicago, Illinois, from somebody I don't know. Who wants to remind me that they'll send me a security system for my house.
Oh, well, good. You should take it.
Yeah, I should. You never know. So, I'm afraid I missed that call. Oh, too bad. It's really annoying how many people have gotten on the no-call list for your smartphones and call you anyway.
Yeah.
That legislation doesn't seem to be working.
Come on, Donald Trump.
So, and they're all scams. So, yeah, in the era of Donald Trump, that makes perfect sense.
He might not fix that. Okay.
I have this story from the New York Times.
Yes.
And it reprises something we talked about on the show, which still turns out to be true. Trump's health secretary pick leaves nation's doctors divided.
Yes,
They rushed to laud him, swiftly endorsing the selection of what they called one of their own.
Oh.
An orthopedic surgeon who has championed the role of physicians throughout his legislative career. Just to say, he's put physicians over patients every single time.
Yeah.
Then the larger world of doctors and nurses weighed in on the beliefs and record of Mr. Price, a suburban Atlanta Republican, and the split among caregivers, especially doctors, quickly grew sharp. And again, I'll reference a piece I put up a couple of years ago about the difference between surgeons and medical and pediatric physicians. In terms of their political affiliation, surgeons tend to be Republicans and conservatives, and pediatricians tend to be Democrats and liberal. Internists are more toward the pediatrician side, and ophthalmologists and neurosurgeons, along with orthopedists, are among the most conservative of all the different physician specialties. And I mention that specifically because of Rand Paul and because of Ben Carson, and of course, both of whom were running for president at the time, and now Tom Price.
Yeah.
So 7 years ago, the AMA support helped lift President Obama's healthcare proposals toward passage, and the group has backed the law with some reservations since its adoption in 2010. But as Republicans push for its dismantlement, deep disagreements within the AMA, which has long wielded tremendous power in Washington, could lessen its influence. That would be a good thing because they're awful. The concerns voiced by dissident doctors do not appear to imperil Senate confirmation of Mr. Price, but they do ensure that his confirmation hearings next month will be as contentious as any help for a Trump nominee, featuring a full public examination of the new president's proposed health policies. That would be a good thing, and that's probably the best thing that comes from resisting Mr. Price. It's not like you'll be able to stop him. You got to pick and choose, and probably Sessions is worth fighting over more than Price. And also the Secretary of State fellow who's the Russian puppet, whose name I forget, but I think rhymes with Putin.
Well, essentially, yes.
Because it doesn't matter who he is. Doctors are divided big time, says Carl G. Streed. Bigly. Bigly. Primary care docket with Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, where I used to work years and years ago. A member of the AMA House of Delegates, the organization's principal policy-making body. The controversy began soon after Mr. Trump announced on November 29th that he had chosen Mr. Price to head the Department of HHS, which controls Medicare, Medicaid, the Affordable Care Act's federal health insurance exchanges, the National Institutes of Health, the Food and Drug Administration, and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Within hours, the AMA, the nation's largest medical advocacy group of which almost no doctors belong, I added the no doctors belong because it's true. It has nearly 235,000 members and calls itself the voice of the medical profession. They really represent about 17% of all practicing physicians, and that's a bullshit number. Issued a statement saying it strongly supports the selection. It noted Mr. Price's experience as a doctor, state legislator, and member of Congress. Here's an example of somebody who actually has experience and expertise. That's not the reason to oppose him. It's because of his policy, not because of his expertise. It praised, in particular, his support for patient choice and market-based solutions and his efforts to reduce excessive regulatory burdens on doctors. So the AMA seems to be shifting back to its conservative roots where it opposed Medicare in the first place. And the article points out the enthusiasm was understandable at one level. Mr. Price has been a member of the AMA House of Delegates since 2005 and was an alternate delegate for a decade before that, according to the AMA and the Medical Association of Georgia. For those who are attacking Dr. Price, I have to ask, whom would you rather have at the helm of HHS, a career bureaucrat, a former governor who views doctors as a cost center to be controlled, said Robert Hertziger of San Diego, an anesthesiologist and former president of the California Medical Association. Tom Price may turn out to be the best friend that physicians and patients have ever had in that role. A ridiculous concept stated by a physician who makes a ton of money and wants that preserved. I add.
Yes.
Many doctors are not willing to take that chance. More than 750 people who identify themselves as members of the AMA signed a letter to the association's board objecting to the endorsement. The unqualified support for Mr. Price is inappropriate because he's been a strong opponent of so much of our clearly delineated AMA policy, which is true. The AMA had AMA policy on issues and contraception and gay rights. Price opposes them, and they said his unqualified support is deserved, they said. Why? Because the AMA will go with whoever is setting prices. A funny name, Mr. Price.
Well,
the fact of the matter is that they would more than prostrate themselves with whoever happens to be in charge of setting rates. That's what they do. They're a lobbying group. They don't represent doctors. They don't represent their membership. They represent a lobby group that wants to make sure that the doctors get the biggest part of the dollar. And if that means that less patients are seen and you don't get health care access, too bad. That's where Mr. Price stands, Dr. Price. They call him both Dr. Price and Mr. Price in the article.
Do they?
Some doctors also said patients could be hurt by major changes in Medicare and Medicaid that Mr. Price, along with other House Republicans, have advocated. So they give some examples. One person deciding not to renew her AMA membership. A neurosurgery resident at Ohio State said the group's support for Mr. Price has increased the chances the Affordable Care Act would be dismantled, which has put her patients at risk. And many, many examples throughout the very long story. The fact that he's been a member of the organization and sat on their board of delegates makes it a little easier for the AMA delegates to support one of their own. It's like when you're in the Senate and you may be a complete hack, but you're a senator and therefore get extra special, careful, courteous treatment. That part I get. But it's the unqualified endorsement without any comment on where he stands on the issues that irks me and so many others, and that's the reason why I and many other physicians want nothing to do with the AMA and have never wanted to have anything to do with the AMA, or at least haven't for years and years and years and years. Mr. Price has supported efforts, for example, it says in the article, to restrict abortion, cut off federal funds for Planned Parenthood clinics, and if confirmed, Mr. Price would be only the third physician to serve as secretary in the 63-year history of HHS and its predecessor, HEW, Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. I'm old enough to remember when that was the name. But in answer to that other physician's question, who would you rather have, a doctor or a bureaucrat? I'd actually rather have a bureaucrat because they have a better view of actually serving patients, not just doctors. That's
true. I guess that's a very interesting view of things. And I mean, pardon me, I understand how in some way it would make sense to someone like Donald Trump to Department of Health. There you go. Put a doctor there. But yeah, interesting observation. It's only the third doctor, but it's a bureaucratic job. You're not treating any patients.
It's an enormous job.
So
it's an enormous, sprawling job, which is responsible for a big chunk of the federal budget. Price is qualified in the sense that he's been through Congress. Yeah. Being a doctor doesn't make him qualified. But he's been through Congress in the budget wars, and so he has a very good sense of it from that point of view.
Yeah, I mean,
it's not unusual for governors to be picked for HHS because running HHS is like running a state.
Yeah.
It's that big, the budget's that big, it's that complex, and you have to get used to that sort of thing.
Well, he has been there. It's going to be interesting watching his confirmation. And, of course, as a member of the House coming before a Senate committee, they don't value one another's intellectual capacities as much, even though a lot of them came over from the House. They consider themselves to have made the leap to the better and more powerful side. The opposite, of course, obtains in the House. They don't think much of senators either. But it will be interesting. And even though the more contentious of the confirmation hearings will likely be for one of their own sessions, this one will be revealing. But in all likelihood, almost everybody squeaks through.
It'll be confirmed, but the debate itself ought to be interesting, and it ought to just highlight, for example, remember all those Trump voters that didn't really believe that he was going to cut Obamacare because we need it so much. This will be a perfect time to highlight, yes, he is, yes, he did, yes, he said so, you voted for him, that's on you.
Yeah. Well, that also will be an interesting test, although I am beginning to wonder, he seems to be backtracking on so many of his major campaign promises, and it seems to be okay with his supporters. I suppose we have to hold out there the possibility that he'll backtrack on this one too.
We shall see, but this is a good time to highlight it. You put in place somebody who is not interested in backtracking.
Right. That's also true. So, well,
maybe with Betsy DeVos over at Education, he'll backtrack on wanting to destroy public schools.
Sure.
And maybe he'll backtrack on not wanting charter and private schools to have any kind of scrutiny.
He may.
Maybe. Yeah, sure. Why not?
Actually, I think personally it's entirely possible and likely and maybe even part of the plan for him to do that and then say, well, it wasn't me. It was these crazy bureaucrats. What are you going to do?
It was Obama.
Yeah. No, that's true. He could always just say
it wasn't mine.
That.
It was Democrats.
Right. Clinton just did it.
Yeah. Bill.
Right.
Bill did it back in the day.
Don't blame
me. I had nothing to do with it.
Who knows? At this point, he could just say anything.
Along that theme.
Yes.
This is Trump is being handed a great. This is now the Washington Post, which hopefully you have access to. Trump is being handed a great economy. What happens when it goes south? By Catherine Rampell. So back in October, a Marketplace Edison research poll found that 2/3 of Donald Trump voters didn't trust government-reported economic data, thanks partly to the candidate's insistence that the numbers are bogus.
Oh, yes.
Now, when you have, I get, we've talked a long time, we understand fully in our gut that people are tribal. But when you have somebody like Trump spewing nonsense, and then you have 2/3 of his supporters agreeing with the nonsense, it's really scary because that means that they'll agree to anything.
Yeah. And
he knows that, and Steve Bannon specifically knows that. And that's the scary part of his presidency. Anyway, Trump will soon take office with among the most favorable economic conditions as measured by the government and private data sources imaginable, and you can bet that he and his supporters will gleefully claim credit until things go south.
Oh, yeah. They're already doing it.
Right. Consumers seem euphoric with multiple measures of consumer confidence reaching business cycle highs. Now, this is partly driven by a sharp spike in optimism among Republicans in the week since the election, but even before then, confidence had been trending upward, which is to say, these are some brisk tailwinds on which to sail into the Oval Office and represent economic conditions quite different from the catastrophic ones Barack Obama inherited in 2009, but Trump's priorities seem predicated on the premise the U.S. economy is still circling the drain. She goes on to talk about the fact that he's going to do a stimulus and what happens if we get a recession. If you fire all those bullets while the economy is doing well and overheat it, then what? What do you have left? What happens when the numbers turn against them, she writes? 3 consequences seem likely. 1, the administration will start searching for scapegoats other than Trump's own party and his choices. Sure. Immigrants, minorities, Fed officials, watch out. 2, assuming Trump will have already signed a major fiscal stimulus package during an expansion, there won't be much powder left in the keg when Keynesian stimulus is actually needed. That is, fiscal tools available to mitigate the recession will be unusually limited. And 3, the numbers will become suspect again. Trump may even try to mess with the official government numbers to suit his narrative. We know that health data is being sent out of the government to private sources, including colleges, so it gets preserved and not destroyed by Trump. We know the same thing is true with climate data. Be kind of a kick if it turns out the same thing is going to be true with economic data, because you can't trust them. Yeah. Somebody else has to have it so that they don't just destroy it and rewrite it. Say, see, things are way worse than they ever told you, because it's like when you go to a Christmas sale, pre-Christmas or post-Christmas sale at a store, and they haven't really changed the price. They just upped what it used to cost and then call it a sale. Yeah. See this $100 item that we sell for all year at $100? Well, it's $200 now on sale at $100.
Oh,
if they have access to the data, they could change that and say things are way worse than we told you, but now it's thank us.
Yeah. Well, they're already set to manipulate the data. Trump's already tweeting that he's responsible for a supposed increase in Christmas time spending, which I don't even know how they measure that anymore anyway. And
if things go well, I don't really care who takes credit for it. The problem is when things go south.
Yes. Well, we know that it will be anyone other than Donald Trump will take credit for that, or will be forced to take credit for it. It's not credit, obviously.
Right. Meanwhile, I'm going to leave you with this Dana Milbank piece. A new solution for Trump and his team of billionaires: ignore the law.
Okay.
Drain the swamp is so October. In another NPR interview on Wednesday, Gingrich said Trump's swamp campaign theme had been relegated to the marshlands of history. Swamp, marshlands, get that? Asserting that he now says it was cute, but he doesn't want to use it anymore. In other words, Gingrich said they're not draining the swamp, then he got yelled at, and then he said, oh, sorry, I misspoke.
Yeah.
Trump in a subsequent tweet said he will continue to use the phrase, but former Trump campaign manager Corey Lewandowski, who just announced he's setting up a consulting firm that will profit from his proximity to the new president, I'm so surprised, told Fox News on Thursday that Drain the Swamp is probably somewhere down at the bottom of Trump's to-do list.
Yeah.
Clearly. They wanted to auction off access to Ivanka Trump. They just distanced themselves from another scheme to auction access to Donald Trump Jr. and Eric Trump, as well as the incoming president. And the General Service Administration has said Trump will be in violation of his lease agreement for the Trump International Hotel because the contract prohibits any U.S. elected official from participating or benefiting from the lease. These laws aren't a problem if the Trump administration follows a Gingrich plan of breaking them. You remember Gingrich said that?
Yes.
Just pardon them.
All right. I can get on that.
Yeah. So, again, a lot to scratch your head about. And We know he was an awful person. The public knew he was an awful person. They voted for him anyway. They will not be forgiven for that. And it turns out, you know what? He really is the awful person everybody thought he was.
Dang.
Mm.
Well,
Wonder who's going to blame for that. So, with that, and with the reminder that he may surround himself with bad people, he may be a bad person, but we're good people. I'll leave you for today. This is Greg Dworkin speaking with my friend David Wallman, Kagro in the morning. We used to chat in happier times. We still chat now. Life still goes on. There's still good people here in the United States, and more of them didn't vote for Trump than did, so worth remembering.
Yes.
And one of the reasons to keep reminding people that Clinton won the popular vote isn't because it makes a president. We know it doesn't. But this guy has no mandate, and there's no reason to treat him like he does.
Okay. I'll tell him.
Okay, I'll do that.
We'll see.
Take care, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.
All right. Thanks very much, Greg. Appreciate starting us off this way. And let's see. All right. Where to go from here? Well, could be anywhere at this point. I'm watching, or I guess a quick review. Everyone needs to. I guess this is the way the world works now. You wake up and see what did Donald Trump tweet last night. And I guess then we have to, that sets your morning agenda, which is horrible and unfortunate. But let's see. This morning, also another way of finding out what Donald Trump tweeted is to watch publications like The Hill tweet in the morning. They will cover it all for you, probably 10, 12 times. They'll tweet out a picture of Donald Trump and some inkling of what he said. The latest, of course, that I just saw was The Hill reporting Trump claims the media has failed to report his charitable giving. Now, of course, the comment, quite obvious comment that comes from that is, if only there were some sort of official document of some kind in which he might report his charitable giving, and he might be able to hold it up as proof to the media that he was, in fact, quite generous in his giving. Of course, that would obviously be his taxes, and he's not interested in sharing that one. But I'm curious now whether there's any hint in The Hill of what the Screamy lady thought was not being reported by MSNBC those few weeks ago when she jumped in. Remember the woman who barged into the interview on the street to insist that he was giving millions and millions of dollars to feed hungry children around the world anonymously each month. You recall that? Of course, no word about that from Donald himself, but maybe he's making that claim now. Let's see. President-elect Donald Trump says he's donated millions to the Donald J. Trump Foundation, even as he accused the media of failing to report his charitable giving. It's interesting. I mean, this is what I saw in the tweet yesterday. I gave millions of dollars to the DJT Foundation, raised or received millions more, all of which is given to charity, and the media won't report. Trump tweeted Monday night. Of course, you and I already know the story. He did, in fact, at one point, give millions of dollars to the Donald J. Trump Foundation. That was, I thought, amply documented by David Farenthold, who made very clear that he gave something in the neighborhood of $5 million to the Donald Trump Foundation, but that was all prior to 2009, and it was at that point that he began to realize that he could populate the Trump Foundation instead with other people's money, and then afterwards, he never gave another dime. So, I guess this is one of those instances where it's technically true that he's donated millions to the Donald J. Trump Foundation. The problem, of course, is that for a supposed billionaire, the $5 million donated about, no more recently than 7 years ago, I guess, or going on 8, represents something in the neighborhood of a drop in the bucket. But it is true he, at one point, gave millions of dollars to the Trump Foundation. Took, I am sure, good, healthy... Well, he probably didn't take healthy tax deductions for it because he was already paying no taxes thanks to the deal that he pulled off probably exempting him from taxes for a good 20 years following the collapse of his casino empire. Anyway, we'll take a look here at the other reporting and the other tweets here in the Hill piece. It's not a long one. On Saturday, the president-elect said he would dissolve the foundation amid mounting scrutiny over potential conflicts of interest with his business holdings. Interesting. Again, as his conflicts go, that's one of the simpler ones and the less troubling of the bunch. But again, where he'll dissolve something, where he's willing to part with some portion of his empire, it's the portion of his empire that he purports actually helps other people. That's the one he's going to close down, and he's going to keep open the other equally or more troublesome aspects of his empire because they benefit him, which is kind of an interesting way of looking at the world. Of course, we learned from the reporting of David Fahrenthold that what was really going on at the Trump Foundation was a good bit of self-dealing. He was using the the money he collected from other people under the auspices of the Donald J. Trump Foundation, which, by the way, we might as well point out was unauthorized by the state of New York, the state in which it was recognized as doing business. The state of New York has rather more stringent reporting requirements for charities that they authorize to collect donations from others. Donald Trump's foundation was not so authorized. He did not do the additional paperwork, did not make the additional disclosures, didn't do the additional auditing that goes along with the permit to collect funds from others. He just simply thought, oh, I have a bank account. I can collect money from other people and use it however I want. And that's essentially what he did. You will recall, of course, that the whole of David Fahrenthold's discoveries, all of his writing about the Trump Foundation and everything he laid bare, grew out of his simple question of what did you ever do with the money you said you were collecting from people to benefit veterans charities back in, what was it, January, February of 2016, when he was skipping a debate because Megyn Kelly was moderating it. So I'm going to skip this debate and instead I'm going to raise money for veterans. And he allegedly did raise that money, and he had something like $1.5 million donated in small dollar individual donations from all over the country, which he steered to the Donald J. Trump Foundation, and to which people cheerfully gave over their money because they did not yet know, and they may still not yet believe, most of the donors, that the Donald J. Trump Foundation was instead a personal slush fund, not an actual charity. But they gave their money over to the Donald J. Trump Foundation, where he left it parked until Fahrenthold asked the question, whatever happened to the money that you collected and who got it? At which point, of course, you may recall, Corey Lewandowski was then sent out to lie for Trump and tell the press, oh yeah, that money was not only distributed, most of it has already been spent by the organizations that benefited from it. And then, of course, the follow-up question of, well, which organizations got it somehow magically led where? To the revelation that nobody had gotten anything, at which point Donald Trump scrambled like a madman to pass the money out so that it could be off his hands and he could say, oh, I gave all that money to veterans. And then he couldn't identify veterans charities to give it to, and he delayed. And he said the announcement he had scheduled for turning over the information or announcing the information about who had gotten the money was postponed, et cetera, et cetera. The et cetera, encompassing other interesting developments, such as when some of the veterans organizations finally did get their checks, supposedly from the Donald Trump Foundation. They instead turned out to be checks from the Stuart Rahr Foundation or from the Carl Icahn Foundation. There were, of course, some checks from the Donald J. Trump Foundation, but the big mystery of all what did he claim to have raised? Just under $6 million. Larger chunks of it were coming from outside sources. It may be able to backfill an explanation and say, well, of the $6 million I raised, in fact, $1 million of it was from Carl Icahn, and $1 million of it was from Stuart Rohr, and $1 million of it was from small dollar donors, and the rest were more sizable chunks from elsewhere. But again, of course, Donald Trump didn't raise that money. Donald Trump didn't put any money into that, as far as anyone knows. And you would only know that, of course, if you had seen his tax forms, and you're not going to see those. So, yeah, that was other part of the news for the weekend. As the Hill reports, on Saturday, the president-elect said he would dissolve this foundation. Of course, we found out over the course of the weekend that the foundation can't really be dissolved. The state of New York won't allow it to be dissolved because it's still under investigation. So it will be interesting to see whether they battle at all over whether or not to consider the foundation as having been dissolved. I would imagine that there's an awful lot of midnight shredding going on if they think they're closing the place down. But, well, we'll probably find out later that the records were destroyed, and oh well. We just have to throw our hands up. What can you do? It's gone. We missed our chance. Well, let's see. Anything else here in this piece? Just a reminder, of course, that he got himself in trouble with the IRS for making a political donation of $25,000 to Pam Bondi, the Florida Attorney General, from out of his foundation. And, of course, other reporting along the way, we learned from Farenthold and others that he was, of course, buying himself giant portraits of himself. The Tim Tebow football helmet, of course, also an interesting one. The more troubling of the bunch of questionable uses of the money, though, was to pay legal settlements reached with the city or town or whatever, however they organize themselves in there, Palm Beach, where Mar-a-Lago sits. He was in conflict with the local authorities there about the size of his hands. No, the size of the American flag that he flew. He flew a gigantic car dealership size American flag on a huge flagpole outside of Mar-a-Lago. They claimed to have some restrictions on the size in the town. He claimed that it was ridiculous to restrict him because a smaller flag would not adequately express the depths of his patriotism. They got into a court battle over it. They decided to settle out of court, part of the agreement being that he would, Donald Trump would, or at least Mar-a-Lago would, pay over some enormous sum of money to a charity of the town's choosing. They, in fact, selected Fisher House, which I believe is, in fact, the charity benefiting veterans, and he cut the check from the Donald J. Trump Foundation. And, that's one of those situations that Donald Trump, I think, plays rather brilliantly, and where you're left wondering whether he's just, not really bright enough to understand the nuance here. And a dumber person, you would say, okay, well, it's wrong and I can't let you off the hook, but what you've done here, you say, well, what's the problem? I used money from my charity to give money for charity, which is, of course, a little overly simplistic view of what happened here. One, of course, you didn't use your money to give this charity. And two, it was charity compelled as a result of a settlement of a legal dispute. And it's awfully dirty, of course, for you to settle the legal dispute using, one, charitable funds, and two, charitable funds populated by other people's money. But he pretends not to get that nuance. I assume that he, at one point in his career anyway, would have been able to differentiate quite easily. After all, he's fairly adept at finding ways around taxation or regulation or any number of other instances of liability attaching by structuring his corporate organizations in such a way that he distances himself from direct liability, or sometimes he even builds in additional layers of profit for himself, as he does with TAG. What was it? I can't remember the name that he gives to his Trump. TAG, right? Trump Air Group, TAG Air. Of course, his fantastic scam in flying his airplane around and using campaign money to pay for the plane's operation, but of course paying himself essentially for the plane's operation through the TAG Air Group. So you know that he's quite adept at tracking money through complex, or again, I think at one point in his life he was much better at tracking it. I think his mental capacity it appears in public anyway to be severely diminished from what it once was. The time we took a look at and listened to his testimony from the early 90s in front of the congressional committees investigating the casino industry and the expansion of Indian gaming and a few other issues, he laid out some very salient points and made some very pointed arguments in very articulate fashion. And although much of the past year has been about his sort of dumbing the rhetoric down for generalized campaign audiences, it's difficult to say how much of it is an act for the campaign and how much is perhaps indicative of diminished mental capacity. It's weird the way he clings to having his kids around, and people have had all sorts of weird things to say about him and about what's happening to his mental capacity. I'm not a doctor. I can't diagnose it for you. And a real doctor, as Greg has often reminded you, would refrain from doing a diagnosis like that based on sound clips anyway. But we all know that he certainly seems to be exhibiting early signs of, diminished faculties. Whether or not it's really true. Like I said, he could be dumbing it all down for public consumption, and we'd have no way of knowing. Just as we have no way of knowing how much he's actually donated to charity, because we've never seen his taxes and are not likely to see them anytime soon. All right, let's see. What other fun things happened over the weekend? Plenty, of course. Here's something weird. We'll shift gears a little bit here. I still feel a little bit congested. It's a tough day to get enough. Feels like I'm not getting enough oxygen here to continue on with the show. A little bit congested from being away for the weekend. Anyway, weird story that Sponson, our good Twitter friend, pointed me to this morning. Not really sure how to categorize this one, but just I missed the fact that it was happening so widely. But it seems worth mentioning at this point. Brawls break out between hundreds of teens, that often happens, at malls across the U.S. Apparently, like several malls all across the country had tremendous disturbances over the weekend. I guess it stands somewhat to reason in that, it's the holiday season. People do return to the stores as soon as possible for returns, exchanges, looking for holiday bargains, etc. after the official close of the shopping season. Though Hanukkah is still underway and Kwanzaa as well, and I don't know, maybe early shopping for Chinese New Year. I have no idea what else might drive people out to the malls other than your regular shopping habit, but it struck me as weird that so many places would have so much trouble on a single day. Of course, we're all sort of used to fights and riots breaking out on Black Friday, which is a horrible commentary on our current condition, but this seemed rather weird. Disturbances that included gunfire as well, which, again, I guess we have to get used to anytime there's a fight of any kind, and lots of them and involving hundreds of people, well, then I guess you'll have gunfire as well. Massive brawls and food court fights, which sounds like it could be fun, but probably is rather disturbing. played out at more than a dozen malls across the country in what proved to be a chaotic day after Christmas. I guess what I'm getting around to is you shouldn't be too terribly surprised. Kids off from school, weird frustrations that always go along with the teenage years, of course, but lots of either money to spend or at least time to waste, and perhaps that's a bad combination, or worse, the combination of time to waste and no money to spend, and frustrating as that is. And then, of course, adding on top of it, it must be additionally frustrating as well to be walking around, as Greg mentioned earlier in the show, realizing, the country is about to be run by Donald Trump, who couldn't give a flip about, I don't think he could possibly care less than he might about the plight of frustrated and penniless teenagers spending the weekend wandering the malls and contemplating a president who lives in a gold palace and has gold-plated toilets on his plane while they're scrambling for ways to stretch the dollars from returning unwanted, I don't know what's, from Christmas. Anyway, the disturbances, some of which were captured on social media, and that'll fan the flames as well, prevented some shoppers from clearing off clearance racks and returning Christmas gifts as they intended. So now we have no idea how much was actually spent over the Christmas holiday, and the bogus claim by Donald Trump to yada yada. Yeah, well, okay, that doesn't have much to do with it. But anyway, thought that was rather odd, and let's see, where were some of the disturbances over the weekends? The mall incidents, which ranged from minor melees to mass evacuations, occurred nationwide from Colorado to Tennessee, Texas to New Jersey. Here's what happened at 7 of those malls. And illustrated by some tweets and video. Let's see, we have the Aurora, Colorado situation. Town Center at Aurora started with a social media post that promised a fight at the town center, so they went spoiling for one. Let's see, morphed into a rather large disturbance. Off-duty police officers working as security guards tried to break up the fight. Then people circled the officers who called for backup. As officers on duty arrived, fights broke out throughout the mall, at a movie theater, at a nearby park and ride lot. Estimation of about 500 people involved. 5 arrests, all juveniles. No weapons recovered, interestingly. Let's see, there's more, of course. Next up is video of Manchester, Connecticut, where another fight broke out, several fights involving hundreds of teens, apparently at Buckland Hills in Manchester. Let's see, just sort of skipping down to round up the names of the malls and the places where they happened. Fayetteville, North Carolina, Elizabeth, New Jersey. Are you interested in the names of the malls? Mall names are always kind of weird and quaint. Let's see. Fayetteville was, No naming of the mall in Fayetteville. Oh, there we are. Cross Creek Mall. It's in the tweets. So just for those of you who are collectors of fine mall names, the Cross Creek Mall in Fayetteville, North Carolina. The Mills at Jersey Gardens. I don't know the mall. I'm just laughing at mall names. Elizabeth, New Jersey's The Mills at Jersey Gardens. You'd think people would be so much more pleasantly inclined at such a fantastically named facility. Let's see. Fort Worth, Texas. Hulen Mall. Hulen. That doesn't sound like a great name. But okay, the Hulen Mall was locked down in Fort Worth, Texas. Part of Lockdown Nation. Does that mean there were gunshots or... Yeah, gunfire inside the mall. Okay. So, how about that? For a random sampling of 7 fun and exciting times at the malls, and I get every indication here that it happened at several others as well. So maybe did it happen at a mall near you? Let's have your report. Okay. Well, I don't know. Weird phenomenon, and I would guess probably going to be a part of our culture moving forward. Something to get used to, like road rage shootings. Hooray for America. Okay, speaking of roads, I don't know. I'm going to change directions because I see an article here provocatively promoted by David Dayen. It's not provocative that he's promoting it. It's his article. But you know how he has an eye for the headline, which he doesn't always get to control. But certainly the tweet that tips me off to the article's publication is always intriguing. He tweets this time, if Silicon Valley needs mass upgrades of the national highway system, I guess there's enough work around to hold off UBI. Oh, okay. And this wasn't even the original of the tweets I had put aside. Of course, we skipped up. Where's the good one? He's writing about the article. I'll have to go into his feed and find it instead. But he had an interesting take on, well, the headline that actually ran on his piece, Silicon Valley's self-serving vision for self-driving cars. That's the headline. Here we are. Autonomous vehicle companies hope to commandeer public infrastructure as a massive subsidy for their business model. That's an interesting way of thinking of the driverless car thing, and I hadn't taken stock of that until he said it. But again, a good point and just another interesting twist on the way of looking at things here. Everyone's sort of looking forward to the advent of self-driving car. Not everyone looking forward to it necessarily, but self-driving cars, a big part of our future, it would seem. And yeah, I guess it's worth pointing out that, it's an interesting invention, but again, like so many other inventions, it only works if there's considerable investment in public infrastructure, right? A self-driving car, though, it may do its best to drive around, say, potholes and other flotsam and jetsam in the public roadways. It depends basically on a well-maintained national network of paved and well-maintained roads in order to work in the first place. But that's your problem. We're just building the awesome cars, and we want to be paid for those. Let's take a look here. This he's writing for, or is published in the Fiscal Times, and just sounded like an interesting take. Uber spent this holiday season trying to experiment on a large American city. Without permits from the California Departments of Motor Vehicles, the company rolled out self-driving cars in San Francisco, albeit the kind that have a human pilot in the front seat just in case. Well, I guess there's that. And that's nothing to sneeze at. It's not a driverless car. But again, that just another sort of interesting view on things. You forget about what's actually happening here. This fantastic innovation of driverless cars. Well, we have to test them. Okay. You want to test them in real conditions too, right? Don't you? Sure. You got to be positive that they can actually work. Is there really no one you have to notify, no permit you have to obtain in order to just say, well, we think this is probably going to work. We're just going to experiment with your city. And I'm sure that they view that as bureaucratic nonsense, red tape. Why are you getting in my way? There is no license for driverless cars. You're making that up. Yeah, but there's some, you don't think there's any interest that the city has at all in knowing we're going to set this robot car loose in your city streets? But, that would interfere with the conditions of the live road test. True, but shouldn't somebody say something? I don't know. I guess not. Well, if you have a driver behind the wheel, I guess that's somewhat less reason to suspect that they really needed to alert somebody. I don't know. Anyway, let's just roll on here. Uber spent the holiday season trying to do this experiment without notifying anybody or getting any kind of permits. The cars were almost immediately caught running red lights, and stop signs, and barely missing pedestrians, prompting the DMV and State Attorney General Kamala Harris, who's on her way to Senate, of course, to demand that they cease operations. Okay, reasonable enough, right? You're almost running people over. But Uber refused, citing an important issue of principle. That's the quote. Important issue of principle. Why would that matter? If the Attorney General says, why don't we stop this? What would be the important issue of principle? I don't know. It's linked. I guess now I'm intrigued. I want to take a peek. I mean, you don't just do everything the Attorney General says. That's true. California threatens legal action against Uber unless it halts self-driving cars. This is reported by The Guardian. Julia Carey Wong, the writer of the piece here. California's Attorney General on Friday threatened legal action against the ride-sharing tech company Uber unless it immediately removed its self-driving vehicles from the roads of San Francisco. The threat from the office of the outgoing Attorney General was contained in a letter released to the public Friday after Uber declared it would defy state regulations, a move that the company said was an important issue of principle. 20 companies have been approved to test self-driving cars in California. Okay, approved, right? So they went through an approval process, but Uber is not one of them. And the company is refusing to abide by the same rules as its rivals, a defiant move that critics argue shows disregard for the law and public safety. Friday's development portends a dramatic confrontation between Uber and California state officials amid mounting anger in San Francisco at Uber's refusal to abide by the same rules as other companies, which is standard operating procedure for those guys, of course. Remember that when they decided they were going to operate buses, or when Google decided it was going to operate its own buses to bring people to campus, or every time Uber tries one of their interesting innovations, they are interesting, but they never get anybody's permission to do these things. And here I am conflating them with other tech companies, but sort of a similar approach in many ways. Google thought it was this fantastic innovation to run its own buses, but never stopped to think about whether they might need bus stops for their buses. They just simply decided, well, bus stops exist. We'll just use the city bus stops and clog up its bus shelters and take up space in its loading and unloading lanes near the stops for our own pickups, which, the infrastructure was built with a certain number of buses in mind, not just anybody else who wanted to come along piggybacking on top of them on a regular basis. But of course, Google saw that as excessive regulation. Uber very much in the same vein, fighting against being regulated as a taxi service, even though originally the taxi services were regulated for very good reason. You were asking citizens of your city, state, what have you, to trust the locality's licensing provisions not to put maniac mass murderers behind the wheels of taxis and simply slaughter anybody that they picked up. And you forget that you're not supposed to just get in strangers' cars. And interestingly, by the way, when we were finally asked in the last couple of years to do just that as a business model, Uber wants you to get in strangers' cars. If you stopped to worry about, well, isn't it dangerous possibly to just get into strangers' cars? At that point, they said, don't worry about it. It's just like a taxi, right? Oh, that's when they were just like a taxi service. Don't worry. You can just go ahead and get in there. We know who the drivers are. We won't tell you, but we know who they are. And although I guess they had a point there in that, the taxi administration in the city allegedly knows who taxi drivers are, and you can go to some dingy basement somewhere and look it all up, but it's theoretically publicly available. You just are supposed to trust the proxy of the taxi medallions in New York or whatever other taxi IDs there are in other cities. Anyway, just Uber tends to operate this way. It might make sense then for us to read the rest of this Guardian piece and then find David's more interesting take on these things. My bet is that things get more interesting when we move over to his article, but this is good background. So, well worth noting, 20 companies have actually bothered to go through the process of getting themselves approved to test self-driving cars in the state of California, but Uber says, I don't really think we ought to have to do that. Friday's development portends a dramatic confrontation between the state and Uber. Harris, a rising star in the Democratic Party, was recently elected to the U.S. Senate. The letter from attorneys in her office said they were acting on a request from California's DMV. The DMV ordered Uber to either remove its self-driving cars from the road or obtain a permit. On Wednesday, the first day the company began a trial of its self-driving taxis in San Francisco without permission. The letter warns if Uber does not remove the vehicles from the road until it obtains a permit, the Attorney General will seek injunctive and other appropriate relief. Earlier Friday, Uber made it clear it had no intention of backing down. Anthony Lewandowski, not Corey Lewandowski, but I wonder if they pronounce it with a V. Lewandowski, but, it's obviously the same origin. Anthony Lewandowski, the head of Uber's autonomous vehicle program, said the rules did not apply to the company's fleet of vehicles because of its particular form of technology. And they may even have an argument there, but again, interesting just how crazy and nuanced the problem can get. They say, we cannot in good conscience sign up to regulation for something we're not doing, he said. Interesting. It's an important issue of principle about when companies can operate self-driving cars on the roads and the uneven application of statewide rules across very similar types of technology. I need more information yet, but now I'm getting the hint. Lewandowski added, you don't need a belt and suspenders if you're wearing a dress. Uber's defiant stance appears to be setting the company on a collision course. Yikes. With California regulators in court. If Uber does not confirm immediately that it will stop its launch and seek a testing permit, DMV will initiate legal action. The DMV told Uber in a letter this week. The requirement to seek a testing permit for autonomous vehicles did not apply to Uber's cars, Lewandowski argued, because, why? The company's cars were not capable of operating without being controlled or monitored by a human operator. Lewandowski compared Uber's technology to Tesla's autopilot feature, saying it's hard to understand why the DMV would seek to require self-driving Ubers to get permits when it accepts that Tesla's autopilot technology does not need them. Interesting. And that's a decent argument. I mean, I guess it's not an unmanned car. It may eventually be an unmanned car, but the tests involve a driver as a failsafe behind the wheel. But, I mean, are they also saying that if it was controlled remotely, would that be enough? I wonder. It's an interesting question. And I guess I can see a difference in theory. I was going to say a clearer example of the kind of strange difficulty you might have in properly regulating these things would be, I did see another article out there today. I didn't grab it. It wasn't particularly relevant, I didn't think. But now I wish I had it. But I don't think I need to prove this to you. Lots of people definitely did as Christmas presents and Hanukkah presents and Kwanzaa presents and early Chinese New Year presents and maybe some sort of Zen Buddhist celebration for all I know. Got drones as gifts. And, immediately comes to mind, the FAA having to sort of scramble to come up with a regulatory scheme for dealing with these unregulated things flying around in the skies. You definitely want to make sure that there's some safety rules involved, and some of these drones can move rather rapidly, fly pretty high, and if you fly them in the wrong place, I guess they could theoretically interfere with the takeoffs and approaches of jet airliners at local airports, etc. Definitely want to be wary of those things, and that comes immediately to mind. But here's a question for you. Rather than a question of how high can you fly your drone, and can you fly them around airports because they might interfere with air traffic, how low can you fly your drone? In other words, who would be the regulatory agency that might, for instance, advise drone owners not to remotely pilot their vehicles at about, let's say, 2.5 to 3 feet, maybe up to 4 feet off the ground, just over the surface of public roadways, and drive them in traffic as though they were cars. I don't know why you would do such a thing, but the fact that you could is probably worth some discussion at some point. I mean, what would you do? Who would regulate? Who would be the regulatory authority that would be in charge of telling you either don't do that, don't drive them around as if they were cars, or if you do, you're at least responsible for what happens on the surface. I mean, what happens if you fly your drone into a car on the street? And, I mean, I assume you're uninsured for the drone, right? But suppose you cause a traffic accident. You know, I guess you could start by asking the question, what happens if you're flying your drone normally 100 feet in the air and it falls into the roadway and causes an accident? But if you're actually if you're flying it over a public roadway, I assume that's prohibited somewhere by someone. But I'm not positive of that. Anyway, I thought that was a kind of a weird question to ask. But I suppose that you could kind of fit that into the questions being asked here by Lewandowski from Uber, right? They say they're doing a totally different thing than the DMV says. It's not a driverless car. It's an automatically piloted car with a driver backup, at least for the time being. And it's true. They make a good point. If Tesla allows you to engage, and are they still in the testing stage for that with the Tesla, or is that out and available? But if it allows its drivers, even test drivers, to engage autopilot technology for limited amounts of time, so long as they are in the car, then I don't see the big difference between what they're doing and what Uber is doing, except I suppose that the Uber car sets out from the beginning to drive on autopilot, whereas a human pilot presumably is taking out and bringing in the Tesla and only engaging the autopilot technology, on the highways, perhaps? I don't know. Anyway, maybe the article has more about it. The first known death caused from a self-driving car, and that's perhaps an erroneous label, according to Uber, occurred in May of this year in a Tesla car using autopilot. Unlike Uber, Tesla is one of the 20 companies that has been issued a permit to test, autonomous vehicles in California by the DMV. So that whole previous 5 minutes flies out the window. If Tesla is driving their cars on autopilot without permits, then why should Uber need a permit? But Tesla does have a permit. Oh. Well then. I don't really know why did they say that? It's hard to understand why the DMV would seek to require self-driving Ubers to get permits when it accepts that Tesla's autopilot technology does not need them. And yet Tesla's autopilot technology does have them. Are they saying that Tesla applied for the permit regardless of the fact that the DMV would have exempted them from applying for one as unnecessary, but they did it anyway? I don't know. Uber began using autonomous vehicles to pick up fares, the article continues, in Pittsburgh in August. The city is home to Uber's self-driving car research facility, and the pilot program was met with enthusiasm by local officials. But in San Francisco, the pilot program has so far been a public relations catastrophe. 2 self-driving Ubers were observed running red lights on Wednesday, the first day of the pilot. The company blamed the traffic violations on human error, interestingly enough, and has suspended the drivers involved. However, the company was not asked about the red light violations during a conference call with reporters Friday and has not responded to follow-up questions seeking an explanation. The San Francisco Police Department's traffic division was not informed about Uber's program until after it had begun, according to the San Francisco Examiner. Brian Wiedenmeyer, executive director of the San Francisco Bicycle Coalition, also raised concerns about vehicles in a blog post. Wiedenmeyer said that he had been invited to take a ride in a self-driving Uber prior to the launch and came away with deep concerns about the vehicle's ability to operate safely in a city where cars share the road with bicyclists. Those vehicles are not yet ready for our streets, he wrote. San Francisco Mayor Ed Lee, who's generally a strong ally of the city's technology companies, expressly warned Uber CEO Travis Kalanick to remove the cars from the roads in a telephone call Friday, according to the mayor's press office. But of course, we know that Kalanick has since been invited to meet with and has met with Donald Trump and has basically perhaps been blessed by the incoming president to innovate without concern for the bureaucratic machinations of the red tape machine. And he, I guess, feels safe in continuing. I don't know that it had anything to do with their meeting, but it couldn't have helped very much. Okay, let's see. Uber is failing to be a respectful civic partner to the city of San Francisco by choosing to put Uber's self-interest before the safety of the residents of their hometown. Ellen Canale, C-A-N-A-L-E, spokeswoman for the mayor, said in a statement. In a blog post published Wednesday, Lewandowski argued that whether the company needed a permit from the state was a matter for debate, adding that Uber had, quote, looked at this issue carefully, unquote. Well, I'm satisfied. And determined that a permit was not necessary since its cars would still have human drivers monitoring them. Lewandowski also appeared to argue that the state of California, home to Silicon Valley, should amend its regulations to accommodate Uber, noting that other states had regulations that made clear that they are pro-technology. Is that a threat to move? Go for it. The conflict has exposed what critics say are the unethical and illegal tactics that the company has consistently used to grow its business. After the controversial San Francisco launch, consumer advocates in California urged law enforcement to impound the self-driving cars and file criminal charges against Kalanick for violating DMV requirements. It's an outrageously irresponsible position, said John M. Simpson, Privacy Project Director with Consumer Watchdog. The DMV should immediately seek an injunction, and Uber's executive should be prosecuted to the full extent possible under law. Well, I doubt very much whether that will happen, but and anyway, excellent background for David's probably rather unique take, I have a feeling. Just to refresh your memory about where we began here. This is David Dayen's piece now in the Fiscal Times, noting that Uber spent the holiday season trying to experiment on a large American city, San Francisco, of course, with its self-driving cars. And, well, we got all the background about the letter from the Attorney General from the Guardian piece. Days later, Uber acknowledged that the vehicles have a problem with unsafe turns across bike lanes, something they knew in pre-launch tests before placing the cars on the roadways with lots of bikes, like in San Francisco. It must have been an important principle or something, David says. Eventually, Uber bugged out of San Francisco after the DMV revoked registrations on all its vehicles. That's one lever of control there. But don't weep for Uber. Arizona Governor Doug Ducey welcomed them into the state for a pilot project in Phoenix. Maybe concerns about beta testing robotic steel projectiles alongside American citizens amount to mere griping, but it actually reveals a core conundrum with this whole self-driving car model. Most experts on autonomous vehicles believe that only real-world field tests, not simulations, will refine the technology so it can interact with often imperfect and irrational humans without killing them. And I can well understand the argument. I mean, I think that's probably necessary. Just not, willy-nilly and whenever you feel like it, I guess. Yes, ordinary humans kill 35,000 people a year while driving, but I suspect people will have far less tolerance for machine errors, leading to similar levels of carnage. So who, besides the governor of Arizona, apparently, would want to subject their citizens to being lab rats in this research? There's only one way around this, and on rare occasions, someone will let it slip. Vivek Wadhwa, I have no idea how badly I've mangled that name, but Wadhwa, A technology entrepreneur writing for the Washington Post spun out a fantasy scenario last week of future commutes through Hyperloop vacuum tubes, with the last mile to the destination accomplished by self-driving cars. He gushed about how autonomous vehicles are already better equipped to handle traffic and could drive safely up to 200 miles per hour in their own partitioned lanes on highways. That's right, the disruption of these vehicles would require the largest infrastructure project in the history of mankind. And Wadhwa knows it. He counsels a wise investment in reserving lanes for self-driving cars over alternatives like high-speed rail. That's an excellent and, I guess, often overlooked point, right? Oh, sure, well, these self-driving cars would be fantastic and could even go up to 200 miles an hour if there were Hyperloop vacuum tubes and then partitioned lanes reserved solely for use by these self-driving cars. So in other words, I could make millions selling self-driving cars if some government somewhere would please build me either, Hyperloop vacuum tubes, or at least lanes in our current road system dedicated solely for the high-speed use of cars that I want to sell people. If you could just please take care of that, I'd really appreciate it. And I guess if you look back in history, it's not unprecedented. I'm sure that mass manufacturers of automobiles likewise benefited from the constructions of roads and paved roads at that. And the government undertook to pave those roads for a number of reasons, and not the least of which was lowering the wear and tear on automobiles, and that's a huge subsidy to the automobile industry. That's true. But, that money's sunk. Do we sink it again for lanes exclusively to be used by these self-driving cars? Good question. I think the vacuum Hyperloop is still something that they would contemplate building privately, and they could still do it that way, or of course public-private partnership. Use our public dollars to build one of these things for private benefit, and then tax us on it and remove the tax dollars, and then not give us any of the benefits and privatize all the profits from it. I guess that's possible too. How wise would this investment be? David continues in his article. Imagine the Eisenhower-era construction of the interstate highway system. Now add every state thruway and turnpike, as well as local boulevards and avenues if you want the cars to reach their final destination. Every one of these roads would need a new, dedicated lane, according to Wadhwa. Even without adding or partitioning millions of lanes, you would need to significantly upgrade U.S. roads to optimize all of them for self-driving autos. You need to paint the bloody roads here. Volvo North America CEO Lex Kersemakers famously shouted to Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti when one of the car maker's own autonomous vehicles refused to move forward during a high-profile test at a recent auto show. There are 3 million miles of roads in the U.S., and a majority of them are in poor condition. It says 3 million miles of roads. Is that all? I have a feeling that number is wrong. But okay, almost all of them in poor condition. Fixing that would require restriping every lane in America or fitting the blacktop with sensors. Right. Has to be something there to guide these self-driving cars, whether by camera or by sensors. Maybe better auto technology can reduce the need to redo all American roads, or maybe you can just have a human driver take over the tricky stuff, at which point you don't have an autonomous vehicle. But instead of investing in stronger mapping or sensory technology, the companies making self-driving cars would rather the government pay to upgrade roads. And just think of the cost of such an enterprise. Donald Trump's alleged $1 trillion infrastructure program wouldn't even come close to getting it all done. David writes, I think normal people would call what we have here a grift. Car companies want to commandeer public infrastructure as a massive subsidy for their business model. And in the zero-sum world of government spending, such a scheme necessarily crowds out transportation that everyone can afford to use. We're already seeing cities cut mass transit spending in favor of giving people coupons for Uber or Lyft. I didn't even realize that was the case, but I probably could have guessed it if you had put it to me. Cut mass transit spending and said, here's some coupons for Uber or Lyft. Considering these companies aren't making money and will eventually have to cash in on their oligopoly with higher rates, this kind of trade-off will eventually price poorer Americans out of getting where they need to go. All the optimistic takes on America's robot-led future make the same mistake of assuming that the whole country starts out on the same level of built infrastructure. Looking at the election results will tell you we have a wide disparity of regional inequality. That makes these best-laid plans impossible without a bigger public investment than ever conceived before to the benefit of corporate executives. This nullifies the other dream Silicon Valley tech types tout to accompany the robot-driven economy, the universal basic income. The theory goes, remember this stuff? The theory goes that in the future, humans will have nothing to do. Robots will do it all. So we must give everyone a small stipend to keep them out of poverty. I question the idea that automation definitively reduces jobs rather than creating them. However, freeing people up with a basic safety net could jumpstart entrepreneurship and allow people to pursue their dreams. It doesn't have to just be a substitute for work. Not a bad thought. The problem is that this dream never reconciles, this dream never reconciles with the multi-trillion-dollar investment necessary to reach that supposed future. Somebody will have to build those new lanes and restripe all those roads. Somebody will have to string wires on poles or burrow them underground to reach every remote section of the country with broadband. Somebody will have to generate the energy that will help all this new infrastructure run. And these jobs should pay well, too. The interstate highway system took about 35 years to complete. We have at least as much work ahead of us if we really want to invest in the future. And we may decide that spending enormous sums of public money for the benefit of a handful of companies doesn't make a ton of sense, in which case we'll still need all those truck drivers and chauffeurs a little longer. This argues for a job guarantee, which would channel public energies into these investments rather than a basic income concept that seems way too premature. I know in the Trump era, arguing about how best to handle future days as of unending human leisure can sound a bit irrelevant, but if the new administration accelerates the trend of handing over public resources to private interests, you can bet Uber will be the first in line. They're already in line now. Our eyes should be open. The glorious Jetsons-style vision propounded by Silicon Valley companies comes with the twist of indirectly siphoning trillions of public dollars into their coffers. Almost as if by accident. Isn't that something? Well, an interesting insight there from David, as always. I think good points made, well worth thinking about. And let's see what other fun things we need to catch up on in order to be, well, that was sort of not a catch-up game, but definitely something happening in the background that you want to keep an eye on before it gets away from us here. Yes, here's something that I thought was a pretty interesting story. We'll probably want to talk about it a little bit with that's right. We might as well get to it now because Joan won't be with us over this Wednesday. Here again, a piece I picked up on in The Hill, though I see TPM is also picked up on the story, and I don't know which. It's probably the TPM, probably the more interesting of the two takes. House GOP proposes fines for live streaming after gun control sit-in. Of course, they had nothing to say about supporting such fines for the Drill Baby Drill sit-in, which was also live streamed, but that's because the Republicans were doing it. And they were doing it for the minority, and the oppressive Democrats were trying to something. But, hey, I'm sure that Paul Ryan can freely get away with saying, well, I would have supported them then, too. They just weren't proposed, and we didn't control the rules because we were in the minority. Now that we control the rules from the majority, no more sit-ins and no more live streaming of events like sit-ins. And we propose some fines to prevent it from happening again. There's some trouble with that, of course, which is why I picked up the story. Kaylin McNeil writes this for TPM. Months after Democrats staged a sit-in on the House floor to call for votes on gun control measures, House Republicans are considering new rules for the House floor and fines for streaming video from the chamber, according to reports from Bloomberg News and Fox News. Interesting. Democrats in June sat on the floor of the House chamber to protest Republican inaction on measures to expand background checks and keep certain people from purchasing firearms. Certain people, of course, would have been the protest that anyone on the no-fly list be included in as well on a no-buy list for firearms, which is a proposal that has its own difficulties, and we've discussed them in the past, but not a perfect proposal by any means. But, since it wasn't going anywhere, the primary interest was in the show of the protest. They held the sit-in for more than 24 hours, you'll recall, forcing the House to adjourn early. The Democrats used social media to stream video from the House floor while Congress adjourned, which is not allowed. Although, I would point out, streaming video from the House floor when the House is in session is likely not allowed either. Photography is pretty closely controlled on the House floor, and C-SPAN is, of course, the most familiar of those permitted to send out live video from the floor. But again, even C-SPAN isn't producing the video itself. They're just taking the feed of cameras owned, operated, and controlled by the House and piping it out through their own cable system. They don't create the video. They just pipe it out, which is always been sort of fascinating to me, but otherwise, photography of the House floor is pretty limited and pretty heavily restricted. And the idea that you can disrupt all of that by simply live streaming from your cell phones on the House floor, it's troubling in that it's not something that you're likely ever to be able to control all that easily. I mean, after all, I guess since it also restricts just regular still photography, they seem to be only worried about the live streaming because, of course, it's an end run around the House's own cameras. And when I say the House controls it, of course, that control falls to the majority and the Speaker of the House. So it's really Paul Ryan basically controls the things, and that part of that agreement, I mean, they were reluctant for a long time, the members of the House, to allow photography or for video at all for whatever reason. And there were good reasons and also, unstated bad reasons, like we don't want anybody. The one, of course, that would come to mind for everybody is they wanted to do everything in secret out of the public eye, which isn't really necessarily what they were concerned about. They were, I really do think, legitimately more concerned about what having constant television video camera coverage would do to the way House business was conducted. That instead of chiefly being about a relatively sedate conduct of the nation's business, it was debate, etc. But certainly the dynamics of the camera allowed for a very different sort of debate and playing to the cameras, and the fact that the cameras and the angles are fixed very early on. It didn't take long for Newt Gingrich to anger then Speaker Tip O'Neill by using the fact that the cameras and the camera angles were fixed very cleverly, I think, to deliver a speech during special orders to an empty chamber, but which made it look on television as though he were addressing a full House of Congress and that everybody was listening in rapt attention to his ramblings, like we do here on this show. And that pissed off Tip O'Neill to no end. And of course, because they're his cameras, essentially, he ordered the cameras to turn around and pan the empty chamber. They do have cameras that can do that, but it's bad production value. They tend not to show that. But it's an interesting it's an interesting concept nonetheless. Anyway, they very early on used the excuse of the cameras, or cleverly used the cameras anyway, to change the tenor of debate. And instead of debating one another as colleagues and as repeat players in the daily game of politics, right? We've often heard that the nature of service in Congress has changed, and even Tip O'Neill himself was saying that things were different back in the days when members spent more time in Washington and they moved their families there and they socialized with one another, and famously commenting that you could fight all day and then go have a drink together at night. And the changes in that were blamed on all sorts of things, including just the sharper partisanship, politics of personal destruction, very frequently credited to Newt Gingrich himself and the way he conducted things. And he definitely was an innovator in that arena, no doubt. But we may have been overlooking the effect of putting television cameras in there. As democratizing as it is, it's also an invitation to play to the cameras and to conduct your politics differently. Whereas a figure like Newt Gingrich, who's so sharply partisan and divisive, would have, absent the cameras in the House, have played so poorly among the only audience capable of observing his antics. That would have been, of course, his fellow members of Congress and anybody who happened to be in the galleries on a repeat basis, the press, for instance. They would have viewed this, it would have played very differently, and it would have set him apart in a way that would have just seen him ostracized in Congress, as indeed he was during the earliest part of his career, before I think the cameras were there. I think it wasn't until the early 80s that the cameras showed up, whereas he was elected, I think, in the late 70s, but I'm not even positive of that. But he may have arrived before the cameras. But he very quickly caught on to the fact that you could play a very different and much more aggressive style of partisan, sharp-elbowed politics with the cameras there, because that sort of behavior would make you extraordinarily unpopular inside the House, but could make you extraordinarily popular outside the House, among your constituents or among other constituencies, which could donate money to help elect people like you. I want a guy who fights like that in Congress for me, people might say, seeing how they fought on television. Whereas if the only conveyance of their sharp-elbowed tactics in Washington, the only conveyance of those tactics to you was through a press that likewise looked down on and reviled those tactics, you weren't likely to get a report that would motivate you to say, yes, I want someone like that in Congress for me, and so I will therefore donate money, for instance, to an organization like GoPac, which is in fact, under Newt Gingrich's direction, dedicated to creating more monsters exactly like him. That was the explicit purpose of GoPac under his direction. They marketed those tapes, I've mentioned them before. The whole point of the campaign in a box was an answer to the question, how can I learn to speak like Newt? Newt Gingrich probably was one of the biggest egomaniacs in politics until Donald Trump, by the way. And of course, as we've mentioned before, to be successful in politics, you kind of have to be at least some level of egomaniac somewhere along the line. Anyway, I was distracted here from the article about fining people for doing, one, for sit-ins, and two, for live streaming. When I first heard about it, there was possibly going to be a fine involved for the kind of activity. But are they limiting it to the streaming? I am not sure. But of course, part of the deal for bringing cameras into the House chamber, which is where I started off on this diversion, was that, it'll only cover when we're in session. And that makes a certain amount of sense. And of course, when they're out of session, it's not very interesting, for one thing. For another, you can't really hear what they're saying. But I guess members felt, be a little uncomfortable to just, show the empty chamber or to show people, meeting afterwards and just milling about and talking. Not really sure what they were afraid of. It might not have been that they were afraid of anything. It doesn't make any sense. Camera should be on when we're in session and should be off when we're not. And of course, so what that would mean is that the power of occupying the House floor, there was never a tremendous amount of power involved in it without television cameras. But of course, once the cameras were installed, you're still without television cameras if you are sitting on the House floor when they're not in session. And the only way to get the word out that you're doing that would be to do an end run around the cameras, which by rule are turned off when you're not in session. I guess if we could convince somebody to change the rules over to motion-activated cameras, then maybe it could be impartial. Whoever's on the floor, for whatever reason, could get coverage, but okay, they're not about to do that. More interesting, though, would be whether it would be against the rules to live stream from the floor when the House is in session, and people could be watching on television anyway, but then still you'd be in violation of the rules and agreements by which the cameras were brought into the House originally, although I don't believe for a minute that Paul Ryan would say offhand that, Tip O'Neill's rules for the cameras are from the early 80s are good enough for me and I don't want any changes whatsoever and I endorse them fully. But it could certainly get to be uncomfortable for members who rely on the fact that while there are cameras in the chamber, they are not close enough and not sensitive enough and not attuned enough to pick up individual conversations going on the House floor on the side. They'll pick up what's on the microphone feeds as intended. But with live streaming from handheld pocket-sized cameras controlled by anyone who happens to have access to the House floor at the time, whether it be other members or aides to those members or who knows what, other workers involved, from the clerk's office, etc., that you could pick up any kind of conversation that they intended to be private, if only because it was, it's taking place in a sort of semi-public space, I guess, but with the knowledge that the cameras and microphones weren't going to pick those things up, you could very easily stream out some rather damaging stuff. And so I could see where they might want to keep a lid on that. But interesting. Whether or not you can prohibit members from doing it, well, you can give it a try. And of course, you could try and throw the fines on top of that. But there are some great difficulties with that, which we'll get to. So some top Republicans had pushed for an investigation into the sit-in. Caitlin McNeil reports for TPM, arguing that House Democrats broke the chamber's rules. And they may have. The new proposal from the House Speaker would hit members with a $500 fine for their first offense, and of the first offense of taking electronic photos or recording video on the House floor, and $2,500 for any additional offenses, according to Bloomberg and Fox News. The proposal would also ban members from blocking each other from the microphones at the front of the House chamber. That offense would result in a referral to the Committee on Ethics. These changes will help ensure that order and decorum are preserved in the House of Representatives so lawmakers can do the people's work. Ryan's spokesman Ashley Strong told Fox News in a statement on Monday. One House Democrat who participated in the June sit-in, Representative Eric Swalwell of California, dismissed the proposal, saying fines would not prevent members from speaking up. He tweeted the following two bits here. House GOP wants to fine me, and Representative Beto O'Rourke and Scott Peters for filming gun violence sit-in. I'll always stand with victims. Bring it on. And, of course, also tweeting, Dear House GOP, you can fine me and House Democrats all the way into bankruptcy for gun violence sit-in, but we will always speak for victims. And very noble position to take. However, we might as well add, just because this is the sort of thing we might do on a show like this, I see some bigger problems with those fines. not the least of which, of course, is, well, one, there's the speech and debate clause, which you might think might stand in the way of penalizing members of Congress in any way, certainly in terms of depriving them of their freedom. You can't imprison a member of Congress for speech and debate, or for that matter, in any situation in traveling to or from the Congress, which, you could probably get away pretty, initially anyway, with claiming that you're always on your way or to or from Congress, no matter what you're doing. But you'll recall from it gets invoked pretty often, and people, you may recall from the Pentagon Papers, or certainly people have hinted that they would try something like it again with other ostensibly classified materials, reading them on the House floor and claiming immunity from prosecution under the speech and debate clause as a member of Congress. Well, it's one thing, of course, to say that you can't be arrested for it or put on trial for it, but could you be fined by the House Ethics Committee? After all, there is, of course, the other prerogative reserved to the House by the Constitution, that it can decide its own rules of procedure and rules of conduct. So could it not fine members $500 if that's, if it agreed to adopt those as rules? Well, I do want to throw out that there's also, of course, some prohibitions on reducing. We'll go to the emoluments clauses again. Remember that there are several of them, but you're not supposed to be able to cut the pay of members of Congress in midterm. And I guess arguably you would be doing just that if you confiscated, if you somehow laid claim to $500 or $2,500 of the dollars that they get paid, and all dollars being fungible, you can't separate those which they already had or had from other outside sources. It would be subject to a constitutional challenge on a number of levels, I think. But I'm not certain that they, A, have thought about that, or B, care about that. Not that I think that they're going to find their way to blast through all of that. I think rather they just say, well, that's a fight that I wouldn't mind having and losing in the courts. And then I would just say, these stupid, out-of-control courts, liberal judges are letting people disrupt the people's business here with these grandstanding tactics. We tried to do something sensible about it, but they just wouldn't let us. And I think that's probably a losing position they'd be happy to adopt. So there's a couple of problems with fining people for this stuff. Some people may prefer, even though, to voluntarily pay those fines, and they can certainly put those rules on the books if they want to. All they need is a majority in the House, and it's easy enough to do. So we'll see where that goes and whether it holds on or makes any sense going forward, but I suspect that you'll see that proposal change drastically and or fall apart in the coming weeks as the House gets ready to return and they begin to write up their new rules packages for how they'll conduct business in 115th. All right, let's see. A couple other interesting pieces developing over the weekend, including just for the heck of it, why don't we wrap up with these two pieces here. We've got one in the New York Times, one in the Washington Post, and we'll save for tomorrow more, let's say, more drilling down into the character of Donald Trump and what he's up to and what he's been doing in the last couple of weeks and how troublesome it all is. We'll need a whole show for that, and by the time we get around to tomorrow, all that will have changed drastically anyway into a new form of crazy. But I wanted to take note of the Washington Post's piece titled, by Philip Rucker, titled "Trump to Inherit More Than 100 Court Vacancies, Plans to Reshape Judiciary." Of course, we all know about the most high profile of the bunch, the Merrick Garland seat on the Supreme Court. That is the subject of the New York Times piece, The Stolen Supreme Court Seat. And I agree with the way they've put it there. Is it an editorial? Yeah, an editorial board entry from Christmas Day, as a matter of fact. The stolen Supreme Court seat, that's the way you should think of it, and that's why you shouldn't feel bad about a supposed legislative coup, as some have called it, in which I propose that Merrick Garland be seated with a 66-member Senate on the early hours, I guess we could say, following the noon turnover on January 3rd of next year. Anyway, we'll set that up a little bit by reading through the New York Times piece, The Stolen Supreme Court Seat. Soon after his inauguration next month, President-elect Donald Trump will nominate someone to the Supreme Court, which has been hamstrung by a vacancy since the death of Justice Antonin Scalia in February. There will be public debates about the nominee's credentials, past record, judicial philosophy, and temperament. There will be Senate hearings and a vote, maybe. But no matter how it plays out, Americans must remember one thing above all: the person who gets confirmed will sit in a stolen seat. I say steal it first, but okay. It was stolen from Barack Obama, a twice-elected president who fulfilled his constitutional duty more than 9 months ago by nominating Merrick Garland, a highly qualified and widely respected federal appellate judge. It was stolen by top Senate Republicans, who broke with long-standing tradition and refused to consider any nominee Mr. Obama might send them because they wanted to preserve the court's conservative majority. The main perpetrators of the theft were Mitch McConnell, the majority leader, and Charles Grassley, chairman of the Judiciary Committee, but virtually all Republican senators were accomplices. Only 2 supported holding hearings. The Republican Party line, that it was an election year, so the American people should have a voice, quote-unquote voice, in the selection of the next justice, was a patent lie. The people spoke when they reelected Mr. Obama in 2012, entrusting him to choose new members for the court. And the Senate has had no problem considering, usually confirming election year nominees in the past. Of course, I would add to this that the people then did speak, and the people said, Hillary Clinton, at the very least, Hillary Clinton ought to choose the next Supreme Court nominee. It was, of course, the Electoral College that said differently. But okay, it's the system we have. But then again, Mitch McConnell was pretty clear. The people should have a voice. The people did speak, but they wanted to listen instead to the Electoral College. He didn't say the Electoral College should have a voice in it. He could have. He knew that's where the power lay. He just didn't do it. Of course, Supreme Court appointments have always been political, and the court's ideological center has shifted back and forth over time. But the Senate has given nominees full consideration and a vote, even when the party in power has opposed the president's choice. That is, until this year, when Republicans claimed that though the Constitution calls for the Senate's advice and consent, senators aren't obligated to do anything. This is a bad faith reading of that clause, even if there is no clear way to force a vote. It certainly obliterates a well-established political norm that makes a functioning judicial branch possible. As Paul Krugman wrote in his column on Monday, institutions are not magically self-sustaining, and they don't protect against tyranny when powerful people start defying political norms. This political norm is of paramount importance because the court's institutional legitimacy depends on its perceived separation from the elected branches, a fragile concept in the best of times. By tying the latest appointment directly to the outcome of the election, Mr. McConnell and his allies took a torch to that idea, an outrageous gambit that, to nearly everyone's shock, has paid off. But while Republicans may be celebrating now, the damage they have inflicted on the confirmation process and on the court as an institution may be irreversible. The slope, is both slippery and steep. Look out for those slopes. If Republicans could justify an election year blockade, what's to stop Democrats in the future from doing the same? Nothing, of course. For that matter, why should the party controlling the Senate ever allow a president of the opposing party to choose a justice? Indeed, in the weeks before the election, Senate Republicans were threatening, with the encouragement of leading conservative thinkers, never to confirm anyone to fill the vacancy if Hillary Clinton won. Can anything be done to repair the harm? One step, as obvious as it is unlikely, would be for Mr. Trump to renominate Mr. Garland. Conservatives will scoff, but they know he's as qualified for the job as anyone in the country. When Mr. Garland was floated as a possible choice for the Supreme Court in 2010, Orrin Hatch, the senior Republican senator from Utah, called him a consensus nominee and said there was no question he would be confirmed with bipartisan support. That's partly why Mr. Obama nominated him in the first place. It's also why Mr. McConnell denied him a hearing. He knew he couldn't prevent a Senate vote once Americans saw an eminently qualified and reasonable jurist testify on live TV. At the very least, Mr. Trump could follow President Obama's example and pick a centrist, someone who commands wide respect and operates within the bounds of mainstream legal thought. That would be an appropriate gesture from a man who lost the popular vote by more than 2.8 million votes and will enter office with the lowest approval ratings in recent history. The shameful, infuriating actions of the Senate Republicans won't be ignored by the history books. In a desperate effort to keep a conservative majority in the court, they rejected their own professed values of preserving American institutions. There's little hope that they will come to their senses now, but they and Mr. Trump have the power and the obligation to fix the mess they created. Too bad they won't, probably. We should probably add that as a good measure at the end. And, of course, we won't have time now to get through the Washington Post's entry in this area. But, again, Trump to inherit more than 100 court vacancies. There's not just the one on the Supreme Court. Many, many vacancies among the federal judiciary were likewise blocked during the last year and remain vacant and available to Donald Trump, of all people, to fill. And we've seen the quality of his appointments to date. It doesn't look good in terms of who he can fill the federal judiciary with. However, there are perhaps some other mitigating factors in all this. One, of course, being that his sister is a sitting federal judge. And who knows, he may listen to her when it comes to taking advice, or he may have written her off long ago. I have no idea. But also there's, of course, the fact that he would have virtually no idea who to put in there. And with that many vacancies, it would be difficult to find that many complete lunatic ideologues. But it's not a challenge I care to issue to his advisors, because they'll do their damnedest to find ways of filling them with just that sort of person. Anyway, time for us to wrap up here on the show, which is just as well as I am rapidly running out of oxygen. I don't know, I feel a little congested today. And, a little bit of deep breathing exercises when we get done here today. All right, thanks for listening in. Do stay tuned, of course, for the after show. We spent a lot of time off of the subject of immediately breaking news and top headlines today, so we'll look to the after show to round up those stories and get things back on track for the news day. It's Red Sky at Morning Tuesday on this news day. That kind of rhymes on the after show. And here's what's coming up. Proclaiming there is no reason to trust him, California Congresswoman Maxine Waters declares a war on Trump. Yay, a new war. A Saudi Arabian man petitioning to end the guardianship of women by male relatives is sentenced to a year in jail for inciting to end the guardianship of women by male relatives. Well, it's a little bit reflexive, but you can understand, right? Saudi Arabia. And scandalously overlooked for the Nobel Prize, pioneering dark matter astronomer Vera Rubin, now dead at the age of 88. So she'll miss out on that special honor. Last half, Chris Reeves, a.k.a. Tom Servo 433, joins them for more news on the DNC chair campaign, a very interesting one at that. Some questions and answers on nuts and bolts and potential structural fixes to negate voter suppression strategies like cross-check. All of that, of course, and more on the after show coming up next with Wink and Justice.
From Daily Kos Radio on networksradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
Thank you very much for listening. We'll be closing out the week in the coming days and closing out the year 2016. Hope you'll join us for a successful 2017 as well. I invite you to take a look at our page at patreon.com, Patreon. Search for me, David Waldman, or Kagro X, and help support the show in the coming year.